Hello and welcome to The View from 22. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor. Was the British Empire all bad? The Oxford academic and theologian Nigel Biggar says no and writes so in a new book. In so doing, he was embroiled in a culture war and was even cancelled by his first publisher. What has experience taught him? He joins me now. Nigel, welcome. You write about these new progressives. Now, you first came into contact with them through a project on empire at the University of Oxford. Can you first tell us about that project, Ethics and Empire?
Yes, Cindy. In July 2017, I and John Darwin, the eminent historian of empire worldwide, set up a project called Ethics and Empire. And the idea of this project was over 5 years through annual conferences to examine how people from ancient China through the medieval period to the modern period, how did they view the empires of their day? And we held our first conference in July. And then in late November of 17, I published an article in the London Times in which I argued what I thought was the anodyne position that we British can find cause for both pride and shame in our imperial past. And it was just shortly after that I put up an online description of the Ethics and Empire project, and that's what got me into trouble.
Now, you're a moral theologian by training rather than a historian per se. So was it the ethical questions that first drew you to the project? Because empire throughout history must be quite rich pickings for the complex reasons that you say.
Yes, and of course, in the Ethics and Empire project, we've involved about 55 historians. Yes, I mean, it's a vast territory. My interest, as you rightly say, was in the ethical dimensions of empire. So I'm in the business, have been in the business professionally of asking questions about good and bad, right and wrong, of complex phenomena like war, for example. Although my first degree was in history and my first love is history, I read it all the time.
Yes, and your piece, and you've also written a book about the British Empire that's out this year. That is more focused on the British Empire. So can we, give viewers a sense of why the moral record there is so complex? What are the things that you think that you wrote 5 years ago now that you think are worth celebrating or are worth being proud of? Yes.
So yes, my book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, came out in February. And you're quite right, it focuses on the British Empire, but I did that because I think what is true of the British Empire is probably true of more or less of many European empires, modern European empires. And I wrote the book because I had come across the argument, first of all, put forward by Scottish nationalists in favour of Scottish independence, that Britain equals empire equals evil, and therefore for Scotland to become independent would be an act of national self-purification. And I've been reading about British imperial history for 30 years or so, and I knew that you cannot say of the British Empire that it was equivalent to evil, partly because, for example, yes, it's true that in the 150 years from 1650 to the early 1800s, some British have been involved in slave trading and slavery. But it's also true that from 1807 and 1833, respectively, the British were among the first people in the history of the world to abolish both slave trading and slavery. So you can't talk about colonialism and slavery as if they were the same thing. And then just to pick another example, if you happen to find yourself driving around the southwest slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily, in Italy, driving eastwards toward River Buto, on the left-hand side, you will come across a World War II cemetery full of young Canadians. And if you wander around the headstones, you'll come across one headstone that belongs to H.R. Anderson, who was killed in July 1943 at the age of 28. And the epitaph describes him as an anti-fascist fighter. And he was a volunteer answering the call to fight Nazism, and it was the British Empire that called him. So if you were against fascism, then you need to credit the British Empire for, between May 1940 and June 41, providing the only military opposition to Nazi Germany, with the sole exception of Greece. So there are some things to be said in favour of the British Empire.
But what about the day-to-day then? Because, these are two good examples of big topics, big things that empire has been against. But what about the day-to-day, the lives of the colonized and the indigenous? I guess it brings to mind that Monty Python sketch, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah. In my book, I'm perfectly clear that the empire presided over bad things as well as good. So if you ask about the day-to-day effect, then on North Americans in the 1600s and 1700s, and on Australian Aboriginals in the 1800s, I'm afraid one of the major effects on these peoples was disease, because Europeans brought smallpox to these parts of the world. Europeans weren't the only ones doing it. Indonesians may have brought smallpox to Northern Australia, and if Europeans took smallpox to North America, they also brought back syphilis to Europe. No one planned to do it. It was devastating, it was tragic and lamentable, but you can't blame Europeans for doing that. It was entirely accidental. So that was one negative impact. But positive impact would be the imposition of imperial authority meant the suppression of endemic warfare between different peoples in Africa or Australia. Or Tasmania. So the empire did have the merit of imposing peace, and if you don't have peace, you can't flourish economically. The East India Company helped to impose peace on northern India in the late 1700s, and there are testimonies to the immediately positive economic effects this had. I could mention the introduction of tropical medicine that for the first time relieved people of sickness through suffering various tropical diseases. So, the empire, the European empire, the British Empire, brought the benefits of modernity, modern technology, modern medicine, modern science to parts of the world that, in terms of scientific and technological development, were relatively underdeveloped. I could go on, but there are a mixture of there are mixtures of goods and evils, and I, in the conclusion, I give a long list of the bad stuff and a long list of the good things.
And that moral calculus is quite interesting, isn't it, Nigel? I wonder if, from an ethical perspective, you risk ending up in a bit of a utilitarian perspective, where you think that the ends are somehow worth talking about, in terms of the means. When you talk about things like economic flourishment, for example, just to be, devil's advocate on this, that is the argument that the Chinese Communist Party uses to justify its rule of China, and has done in the last 30 years since economic reforms. So where do you draw the line there then? Because sure, the colonized had better roads and better economies perhaps, but they were still colonized against their will.
Well, it's not. It wasn't always the case. It's too simple to say they were colonized against their will. In some cases they were. The truth is, in most parts of the world, the lower classes, the peasants, they were used to being ruled by people that ruled them. It doesn't matter whether they were in India, whether they're Muslim Mughals or Hindus or Brits or French. Most people in the world were not in control of their lives. They were always ruled by someone else. The Brits were just the latest. But it's not true to say that natives were always ruled against their will. You mentioned China. So why was it that no one knows how many millions of Chinese people voluntarily left the Chinese mainland and entered Hong Kong in the late 1950s and 60s because of Civil War and because of communism on mainland China? Now, Hong Kong was not a democracy, but it provided the rule of law, and it provided stable institutions, and people were able to build, compared to what was available to them on the Chinese mainland, able to build decent lives in a stable environment. And that's Democratic choice is good, but I think actually in terms of the lives of people, a certain stability that allows you to build a life secure from external threats is probably more basic to political good.
Now, Nigel, as I talk to you, I can see why you have had negative experiences with these new progressives.
I can't imagine why.
Well, what you're advocating for is very nuanced, and I think empire is a very emotive topic, as you know. Were you surprised at the reaction to your project and to your book?
Well, back in 2017, I was shocked because for two reasons. One is the Ethics and Empire project was not about defending empire. I suppose it did make the assumption. In fact, it did state the assumption in the online description that we don't assume that empire is always wicked. That sometimes it can be legitimate. So I think that was probably, in the eyes of some, that was our cardinal sin. But one of the things we discovered early on in the project was that if you want to find, as it were, critiques of empire in ancient China or in the medieval Arab world, you won't find them. They don't exist. You will find discussions of what makes for a good and bad emperor, but empire as a political form was taken entirely for granted. An empire has been a common form all over the world, practiced by people of every skin colour until the modern period. So the Ethics and Empire project was a genuine academic project. It wasn't at all saying that empire is always to be defended and praised. And then when I published that article in the London Times in November, again, I thought, who can possibly say that British Empire doesn't contain good things as well as bad? I mentioned some of the good things. I mean, you may decide in the end that it was more bad than good. Although I'm not a utilitarian, I don't think you can do that. I could talk more about how I go on to make a moral judgment, but I don't think you can do that. But you can't. I don't think you can deny that the British Empire did some good things. But I discovered that the assumption of the Ethics Empire project, namely that empire could be legitimate, and my argument that British Empire could do good things, that clearly was unacceptable to a group of academics and historians who subjected me and the project to a series of online denunciations in the space of a week in December 17.
Yes, and off the back of that, you got a book contract from Bloomsbury Publishing to publish An Intelligent Person's Guide to Colonialism. Now, there was a whole saga over that book because you wrote it, but Bloomsbury then dropped it. And what you heard was that it was pressure from younger members of staff, although Bloomsbury, I think it's worth saying, say that books are dropped for all sorts of reasons. But I was pleased to see that it was picked up by William Collins and actually was published earlier this year. Now, you recently had a piece in The Spectator looking at the people who sought to tarnish your name back in 2017 and also over this book. You call them the new progressives. So what do you think motivates these people?
Well, shall I just explain a bit as to why the question arises?
Yeah.
It goes back to the Rosemas Hall agitation in Oxford in 2015-16, when students were clamouring for the dismantling of a rather obscure statue of the late Victorian imperialist Cecil Rhodes, who died in 1902, and I was aware of this, and in fact I was 2/3 of the way through a very fat biography of Rhodes by Robert Rockburd at the time, and one thing I noticed was the claims being made that Rhodes was South Africa's Hitler and that he committed genocide, which is not true historically. So one thing I observed was whatever's motivating these guys to clamour for Rhodes' downfall is not history. And then secondly, I noticed at the time when they were protesting in Oxford, and the leader of the campaign was a young South African Rhodes scholar, cheerfully biting the hand that was feeding him. And he was from South Africa, as I say. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Jacob Zuma was looting the South African state, bringing South Africa to the verge of insolvency and exposing its people to destitution. And I noticed that here are all these rather privileged Oxford postgraduates on scholarships to come study at Oxford, clamouring for the downfall of a long-forgotten, long-dead British imperialist, while South Africa is burning. And about South Africa, they had nothing to say. So that's what raised the question, so what's really going on here? I just read recently, and I mentioned this in my article, a book by Rakib Ehsan, who's I think a Pakistani heritage Briton. His book's called Beyond Grievance: What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. And he makes the same observation about left-wing anti-racist groups, that the evidence is that in Britain we don't have ethnic minorities on the one hand being oppressed and disadvantaged by white people on the other. It's far more complicated. Some ethnic minorities, Asians, do extremely well, do far better than white Britons. West African Britons do better than Caribbean Britons, and they all do better than poor whites. So it's much more complicated. And he said, nevertheless, and he's talking to the Labour Party, of which he's a member, I think, certainly votes for it. He says, nevertheless, Labour and anti-racism groups remain wedded to peddling a radical American origin racial politics, according to which Britain is systemically racist, and it's all because of white prejudice. So again, the discrepancy between, as it were, the real causes of inequalities between ethnic groups and the protests raises the question as to what's really going on here. Because, if you really care about injustices between different groups in society, then above all else, you want to understand what are the causes of it. Because unless you understand the causes, you can't remedy it. But it seems that many people on the left, committed to anti-racism, don't want to hear any diagnosis other than simple racial prejudice on the part of whites.
So it's what you think motivates them as a victimhood narrative. I mean, it's interesting in your article, you also spot a certain kind of Christian sensibility, but one that's rather corrupted.
Yeah. So yes, you asked, what does motivate these, in this case, these progressive anti-racists. And I'm not talking, no doubt there are people in there who sincerely believe what they're saying, but it is odd that they're not curious to know, if there is evidence that prejudice is not the cause. If there is evidence, then if they really cared, they would be curious about it, and they're not. So what's motivating? Well, Ehsan himself suggests money, that anti-racist groups depend for funding on there being a problem. So it doesn't serve their interests if the problem goes away, or if the problem is not what they say it is. So partly money. To that I added the fact that, of course, there are plenty of people who have built their careers, their political careers, on anti-racism, and they've made all sorts of friends and allies on that basis, and it would be quite costly in terms of career for them to start backtracking.
And you've also got a very burgeoning diversity industry these days, going into major corporations to train people on their unconscious bias.
Okay, of course. Oh, yes, you're quite right. So there's that too. So as it were, the business has expanded, and to start saying things are more complicated means it's a threat to business. So ironically, I mean, people on the right can behave this way too. Let's be clear about that. But ironically, for the left, there may be an element of commercial interest here that is at stake. So there was that, but I still think there's something deeper, and I mentioned this in the epilogue to my book. I just find it odd that people believe the worst of their own country when the evidence says they don't have to. Right? So if it were true that Britain was systemically racist and that our colonial history was a litany of racism and oppression and violence, unwarranted violence, then as a Briton, I should accept that because it's true. But the evidence is that it's not. So why do people continue to believe it's true when it's not? And indeed, why do they behave, why do they react to people like me who say, here's the evidence not true, Why do they react not with curiosity, not with skepticism, but with aggression? So as I mentioned, in December 17, lots of academics got together to try and shut down my project on ethics and empire, which wasn't an invitation to discussion, it was a repression. Why behave that way? Well, one explanation which I think is plausible, and I got this really from Pascal Bruckner, the French Jesuit educated philosopher. It's a kind of degenerate Christianity. So Christians believe that truly saintly, virtuous people are people who are deeply aware of just how unvirtuous they are. So there's a kind of paradox there, that you're deeply aware of your own sinfulness and flaws, which makes you, ironically, paradoxically, more holy. And that's a good thing in many respects, but it can be perverted. So the thesis is that some people nowadays think that if I can declare myself or my culture or my nation to be uniquely sinful, it's a kind of perverse way of retaining the moral high ground. And Bruckner says this is what Europe's doing. Europe is no longer a superpower, doesn't rule the world anymore, but it tries to be a moral superpower by saying we are the worst oppressors ever in the history of the world, and no one did it as bad as we did. So it's a kind of virtue signaling that makes us feel more righteous because we are more self-critical than anybody. It doesn't matter about the evidence. Now, what's significant about that is this is not about the disadvantaged. It's not about the poor and the oppressed. It's about the crusader. It's about the anti-racist crusader. It's about the decolonizing crusader. It's not really about them. It's about us. And that, I think, is plausible.
And finally, Nigel, because we're rapidly running out of time, but do you have hope for the future when it comes to discourse in this culture? Are you optimistic about where we might go from here?
Yeah, certainly I am. I know there are colleagues of mine who are very dismal about it, but no, I am, because a lot has happened in the last 4 years in this country. Since I first got into trouble 6 years ago, we've had the foundation of the Free Speech Union in early 2020, which does great work in holding institutions to account and embarrassing colleges and sometimes even publishers in terms of the suppression of lawful free speech. Also, we've had the government's legislation on higher education freedom of speech will be very effective once Ahmed, the new director of freedom of speech, gets up and running in supporting academics and students to speak their minds within the law on race or gender or colonialism. And on the race issue, not only did we have the government's CRED report, the Tony Sewell report in 2021, since then we've had Rakib Ehsan's book this year. We had before that Tomiwa Owolade's also very good book, This Is Not America, Why Black Lives Matter in Britain, which both Ehsan and Owolade really confirm the CRED report's claims about this is not black versus white, it's far more complicated. And sometimes the disadvantage is not the result of prejudice, so there are other causes too. That's good. And then the fact is, my book got published. It has sold twice as many copies as my Bloomsbury editor predicted. And I noticed a number of other books pushing back against the radical decolonizing, anti-colonialist trend. So there's still a lot more to be fought, but I'm not discouraged, and I think we can achieve more balance in years to come.
Nigel Biggar, thank you for ending on a note of hope. Thank you very much for joining the show.